Hi everyone! Today we are painting a simple bird using just a handful of brush strokes and only a few colors. Earlier this week I painted a few of these little birds in my sketchbook, and today we are going to paint this one together. I'm starting with a pretty simple sketch. This little bird has an oval-shaped body and then a head pointing in one direction. I'll mark in the wings, the beak, the feet, and of course the eye, but I'm not getting bogged down on all the details. The nice thing about this project is that you can kind of shape your bird however you would like. It does not need to look exactly like mine. Birds can be a little wonky and have some fun shape to them. I'm painting with a pretty traditional red, yellow, blue primary color combination and adding burnt sienna to my palette. I will list the specific colors below, but feel free to use whatever you have on hand. Okay, if you have painted with me before, you know I like to start with a layer of underpaint. I'm using burnt sienna mixed with quite a bit of medium. I'm using a satin medium, but you can use whatever you've got or even dilute your paint with water. So you will just spread that in a nice layer right over your sketch. It should be thin enough that you can still see your sketch underneath. Once that has dried, you can move on to painting your bird. I'm going to start with a grayish purple. So to mix that, I'm using mostly white with a dab of red, a dab of blue, and a tiny dab of yellow to neutralize the color. And I'm just going to paint in the shape of the bird's tummy. Next, I'm going to darken this grayish purple just a bit and add a shadow to the lower part of the little bird's tummy and maybe a tiny bit up on the head. I've mixed a warm peachy color and I'm adding that to the head. And then I'm just going to make a couple variations of this color. Maybe tone it down a bit with a more grayish brown, maybe some with a little more pink, and add a couple paint strokes of each of these to the bird. I'm even adding a tiny bit of warm, bright red around the edges of the bird. You can follow along and make marks exactly like I'm making them, but there's no precise way that you have to do this. It's really all about combining paint strokes in a variety of colors without hyper-focusing on detail. This will give us a lot of movement and a painterly feel rather than a realistic bird. I've added a bit of lighter yellow and then a fully saturated yellow on top of that. Then I'll add a nice splash of pure white to show the brightest highlight on the painting. Okay, next I've mixed a darker warm brown and I'm just marking in what will be the darkest areas of the painting. The bird's wings, the tail, and a little bit of shadowing on the head. Now, when it's time to add in our darkest details for contrast, I'm mixing together a good amount of pure blue with pure red and then toning it down just a bit with yellow. I'm going to use the dark purplish black to create a little branch that the bird is sitting on. So this makes a nice dark purplish black, but it's a little more interesting than using black straight from the tube. I will use my thinnest liner brush to mark in some little details with this dark color. I'll add the beak, I'll define the wings, I'll mark in the feet, but in kind of a scribbly way. I'm not worried about being precise. I'm going to mark in the tail as well with this darkest color. Okay, I'm also adding in a bit of highlighted areas. These are just a little bit lighter than the rest of the paint I used, And this will show where some sun might be hitting the bird. And of course, every eye needs a tiny speck of white to help it look realistic. All right, I'm happy with my little bird, so now I'm going to mix up a nice warm pink for the background. So for that, I'm using white with a bit of red and warming it up with a touch of yellow. I may also tone this down just a bit with some gray so it's not quite so bright. And then I just paint a nice layer in the background. When I get close to the bird, I'm careful to create the outline that I want. So for instance, I'm cutting into the beak area just a little bit to make it really narrow and pointy. And then when I move around the body of the bird, I'm actually purposefully allowing a little bit of that background to show through in some spots. I don't do this everywhere because I don't want it to look like a defined outline, but I do like to leave a little bit of that background showing through in just a few places to make it a bit more interesting. Once you have the whole top area filled in, you can do what I'm doing or pick a different color. I'm mixing a slightly different shade of pink for the bottom just to add a little bit more interest to the overall composition. So I'm just darkening up my pink, saturating it a bit more with red and a little more yellow. Then I'm just going to fill in this bottom area under the branch. And that's it for this painting. We will take one moment for a super satisfying tape peel. This is definitely one of my favorite parts of the process. Okay, here is our finished painting. Super simple, super quick. I hope you give this a try and I would love to see what you make. Happy Friday!